How healthy is meat? Is it really bad for the environment? Is fake meat a good idea? Welcome to my series on meat. We'll be discussing all of these issues, and while I don't have the answer to all of these questions, I'll share with you what I found in my research and how I like to approach the topic of meat. In this first part, we'll take a look at the meat industry, their practices and environmental impact. Let's get into it. In many of my previous videos, we've talked about the mainstream food industry and how it's designed to favor economic interests over the health of the public. This system is structured to maximize their profit at the lowest cost, and with the help of the media, they've pushed their narrative with false ideas of what we should be eating and what we should be avoiding.
And after this complete breakfast, including my vitamin-packed Frosted Flakes.
The good news is that we live in the information age, and that means that it's up to us to take responsibility for our health and to put in the effort of doing the research and looking for the foods that will help us and the ones we love to live in an optimal way. Thankfully, the information is out there. So what does this have to do with meat? Everything. Once again, here we have an example of how industrialization can drastically change the nutritional composition of food. Animals that are raised in a factory-like setting are confined into very small, unhygienic spaces without access to fresh air or sunlight. They are fed an unnatural diet of high GMO foods such as soy or corn, often contaminated with pesticides, and they're given growth hormones and antibiotics. I've even read that in the US they sometimes feed them with candy. How can we expect anything healthy to come from animals that are forced into these inhumane, unnatural conditions? The meat from these cows is higher in omega-6 and lower in omega-3. Healthy meat comes from natural ecosystems where the cows can eat grass as nature meant it to be. In these last few years, I've increasingly seen the claim that livestock is one of the worst threats to the climate. It's important to take into account that the environmental impact of cattle will vary depending on what part of the world we're talking about. It's complicated to talk about this in global terms. Cows produce methane as part of their normal digestive process, which in large amounts can harm the atmosphere. But the numbers have been blown out of proportion. Before there were modern cattle and agriculture, there were wild ruminants: bison, buffalo, wildebeest, mufflon and goats. There is no conclusive data, but it's estimated to have been many more ruminants than we have now, and they all produce methane. Naturally, these animals are part of the carbon cycle, or at least they should be. Yet methane has gotten much worse since these industries started existing. Not only factory farming, we're also talking about landfills, oil and coal mining. Let's look at the case in the US. Based on the information from the US Environmental Protection Agency, agriculture contributes 9% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and animal agriculture contributes by 4%. If we take a look at the data, it's undeniable that agriculture has a carbon footprint, especially the industrial agriculture I just mentioned. But this doesn't mean that going vegan will solve the climate crisis. While there are other legitimate reasons to go vegan, which I respect, it doesn't seem like it can do much for the planet. I personally feel more concerned about the other sources of carbon emissions. And we have another, perhaps more urgent problem on the table, and that's food waste. In fact, regenerative agriculture can actually help the planet. In the current state of things, there is no easy way of solving the ecological and nutritional problems that have been created by factory farming. My personal feeling is that the conversation should focus more on farming practices, rather than whether we should give up meat completely or not. We're probably not going to find an easy nor accomplished solution, but there are some interesting innovations and initiatives that I have high hopes for. Regenerative agriculture is one of them. Regenerative agriculture is a different approach to farming, where it's all about creating conditions as similar to the natural ecosystems as possible. This increases biodiversity, improving the health of soils and increasing the water holding capacity of the land. This naturally leads to higher quality protein as well. Regenerative agriculture would also help focus on supporting the local economy, instead of depending on far-flung supply chains, as well as improving labor conditions for farm workers. What I love about this is that it's good for our planet and good for our health. I find it encouraging to see so many initiatives supporting these practices and spreading awareness. But I do wonder, how can this be done at a global scale? I don't know. It would require some tremendous changes, and not only from farmers and consumers. Again, it's incredibly complex, and I don't presume to know the answer, but we can at least do our part by supporting local farmers when possible. To me, the best meat out there is game meat. deer, wild boar, antelope, different kinds of birds. It depends on what part of the world you live in. This is the hunter-gatherer approach that's closest to what's natural for us. But unfortunately, this is something that we very rarely have access to and can't do on a global scale. So about fake meat. First of all, I'm 100% in favor of plant-based foods. They're actually a huge part of my diet, but I make sure they're natural, whole foods. I'll always be skeptical of any food item that is produced in a lab. And these meat alternatives are produced through the engineering or proteins. Many brands use GMOs as well. I'm concerned about the impact these types of hyper-processed food products can have in our cells. Their full effect is not yet known. But as I always say, we can find the healthiest foods in nature. The meat we can get from animals that are raised in regenerative conditions will have the most nutritional value. Their nutrients are the most bioavailable. In the next part, we'll go deeper into the nutritional value of meat. So stay tuned and thanks for watching.